Zeppoverse literary mechanism ingredient note. The following is a mechanism in the literary universe that I'm crafting, which I've been contemplating for a very long time, trying to figure out how to describe, and that I just sort of got a very clear picture on as I sat here in meditation. So I thought I'd capture it and sort of describe how it works, both in its literary mechanics, and by that I mean the way literature invokes imagery in the mind. I don't know how other literary analysts would define the term literary mechanics, but in my postmodern independent definition, meaning use, slangification of that term, in my world building, I mean the way Mr. Zeppo means it. If the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo were explaining this to you, dear listener, whoever you are, including me, myself, and I, he would be standing next to you and saying, listen, imagine the following. Imagine that you and I are talking, right? And it's happening. It's a conversation you're having with me. I am the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. You're looking at me. My face is a weird sort of shield-like, but also living, chromatic, globular mirror shape that somehow manages to emote as if it were a normal human face. It's not. It's featureless. But as if you could sort of imagine my face behind a face shield in its polymorphism and in its sort of liquid livingness. I am sort of like a Terminator robot. It looks like a Terminator robot liquid form from whatever that one particular movie where the girl is a full nanite liquid robot and she can liquid mutate into anything and whatever. Or the second one, the best one, Terminator 2, which many people confuse as the original, which is not. I digress. So whenever we talk, you and I, unless of course I'm wearing one of my normal people faces to fit in society and look like a person of that planet, which is my real face. It just changes. My real face is also this shieldy thing, the silver mirror shieldy thing. And especially when the shieldy mirror is up, but when any of my main character faces are on, like if I'm being Mr. Zeppo from the 20s and 30s in the retrofuturistic, anachronistic, sci-fi, steampunky version of the Roaring Twenties, sort of a la Great Gatsby reference and homage, or it be in the dystopian future of Trumptopia from any of the Trumptopian books. If we have a moment, a special moment, where it feels like you and I sort of feel almost free from the world because of the depth or magnitude or importance or significance of the conversation that we're having, and we're looking and we're making a lot of deep eye contact, in that moment, you have to understand that as kind of, did you ever see Free Guy? Don't sue me, whoever owns Free Guy. But they did a really great mechanic of this, in as much as they showed you, for example, when Free Guy was getting what was it? He was stealing something from some guy at his main personal fortress, and it was a major player in the game. I forget what he was taking. It was a clip. It was a data packet of some kind. I think it was evidence. But when he's talking to him, he turns to talk to his audience. But what we see is him sitting at home, the actual player of the character, in an impossible, there's no game mechanic for how any of it would work. And he wasn't even touching the controllers. He was just chatting kind of way. And we see that later in the movie. It's one of the only real world, fantasy world flaws. But action happens on screen and their characters do stuff. They weren't touching a controller. They weren't on a keyboard. They were just, responding or whatever. That guy's eating licorice when this entire conversation is happening. But in here, in your real life, right? Because whoever you are that I'm talking to, if you're a character in my book, if I'm visiting you, it's because you're a character in my book. Because everything that happens to me is stuff that happens to me in the many books that chronicle my multiverse adventures. Because everyone now will infinitely, forever, in most multiverse universes, affiliate and associate and deeply attach the word multiverse with the title Multiverse of Madness, which belongs to Marvel and belongs in that universe. I am reticent to use it anymore for fear of looking like I'm just trying to ride along and be a copycat. I've been working on this for 25 years. And it's always been a multiverse thing. I just have never known how to. I've never written most of it. I certainly haven't published any of it. I've just been note taking and grabbing audio tapes that I lose and never transcribe, and thinking out loud and telling people about it and writing blurbs and chapters and things that as they come to me, which is a terrible way to write something because it's all disparate, it's all disconnected, and it's all out of date. It is a great way to develop something, and if I'd been a little bit more fastidious with my organization and my archival, I'd be more on top of my game. But here I am. My point is, dear friend, as you and I are having this conversation, it's happening in the minds of the readers of my book. Wherever, in whatever past and or future, my books become realities in whatever universes they are reading them, because that's the universe you're trapped in. That's the Zeppoverse. The Zeppoverse is a universe in which everything that happens in the media created by the artist known as Zeppo, or Zed in one universe. I think that's the core universe, where he goes just by the letter Z, which is unfortunately deeply affiliated with. He's got to rebrand the letter, for fuck's sake, because it's so attached to zombies, and there's nary a zombie. There'll be some zombie parody mock and Tippo the Hat references because some zombie properties out there, some some zombie themed or focused intellectual properties out there are awesome or have had great moments or have just made history, and others are just tedious tripe that I'm not interested in whatsoever, and I'm not going to get into the discussion of that now. But there's not zombies here. There's just the letter Z. And its integral affiliation to the structure of the universe in which this character lives, and his sci-fi theorization that he brings to this as an intellectual property that brings to this universe, that in theory should be translatable to almost any universe where anyone might, in theory, consume any media where this becomes reality, right? So somewhere out there are other universes where entirely different people beyond myself and or the me, myself, or I character, the writer, the theater artist, and the whatever the other category is, because it's also variables, where they are the main writers. They're just characters in another zone of it, okay? So you and I are nested in this deep nesting of fictionalization. Although here and now, in our living of it, it feels very mundane. It feels very real. It feels very normal. And day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, most of your life, the majority of it is not in the book. The majority of it is not in the movie. The majority of it isn't in the video game, right? Like, just the parts that become the product will be part of that shared collective hallucinatory experience that the audience envisions and projects and perceives as they engage with whichever media. Since we're discussing it in the example of a book, or since I'm recording the podcast, in which we discuss the backstory and the back behind the scenes methodologies of the book, but is itself a fictional property in the Zeppoverse universe that fictional characters listen to, and that real life characters in the real world, in their real world, listen to, and is nested in the same way the books are. Whenever there's like a focal moment here, now, like this, in this recording, in this page, in this chapter, in this moment in the video game, in this moment in the movie version, when you and I or a group of characters have like a wah, wah, wah moment, and by wah, 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 I mean like a weird, vibey, enigmatic, difficult to describe, hyper lucid, hyper visually vivid, visually like indistinguishable with our mind's visualization of things. Everybody has those moments, right? They have those moments, whatever you're thinking about or whatever you're discussing with someone, especially. And almost all cultures and all universes and all metaverses and all multiverses, because all of those things are one component of the giant metafractal of both the reality as described in the fiction and theoretically as found in real realities, because the two things are almost indistinguishable if the fiction is describing accurate metaphysics, spiritual physics, and science physics, which is an overlapping Venn diagram of different ways of approaching whatever the fuck physics is, and the universe and its ways of phenomenologically being, of which you are a focal point. You. Yes, you. Dear listener, dear reader, dear video game player, vis-a-vis the character that you're playing, reading, affiliating yourself to in the book, associating with yourself in the movie as designed, to have this moment where you have the first person view of having the conversation with me now, and then it pops out to a third person view that sort of slowly zooms back. It doesn't matter where it's in. Imagine if you're listening to the podcast, just imagine all that. Imagine that you and I have been having this conversation, and you've been thinking about it, visualizing it in your mind from the first person point of view of you and I and me talking. Now we have the dramatic moment with a bit of, music that invokes like an increase in tension and audience like emotional alertness and, character like emotional alertness and some sort of phenomena happening. There's a zooming out of the metaversal cinematic point of view camera. And now you see some sort of like over the shoulder 3/4 shot of you and me sitting on the floor, Indian style, together in this room where we've been invoking these, metaphysical practices, which don't need to be described again because the audience knows. And and I know, even someone who dropped into listening here in this particular moment, they might not know the behind the scenes stuff. Just imagine whatever you want. No, actually, it's all weed. Just weed and meditation and sonic vibrational stuff. And the hyper visualization of the meditative theater of the imagination, right? Anyone who's been listening to the podcast long enough knows that that's where the podcast lives, right? And if you don't, you need to go back and listen to some episodes where I invoke it. I probably should create a new meta episode where I really invoke it. But I digress. As that zooming back to that kind of 3/4 over the shoulder shot where you can see both of like partial profile view of us as depending on what our gesticulation is as we converse and we lean in towards each other and make eye contact, right? And that during that eye contact, your perspective went with the camera. You are seeing yourself from a sort of slightly over your shoulder. You see part of your back, you see the 3/4 of your profile, most of your profile, and you see you making eye contact with me, right? And now we both look back and try to see the camera. It's not there, it's invisible, but we're now looking at the audience. From the audience's perspective, if you were sitting in a movie theater, dear audience, you'd be watching me narrate and explain this in your seats going, what the fuck is going on? An awkward, nervous giggle ripples through the audience as you and I, looking back at each other briefly to make eye contact again and looking back at the camera to spike the camera dead center. And feel that weird, creepy vibe that gives some people who try to be actors a headache and is why indigenous Aboriginal peoples from around the world, when they first encountered, independent of whatever historical time frame it happened, when they first encountered photographic cameras, and I'm staring dead in the center of the camera right now, so it doesn't matter where in the theater you're sitting, it should sort of feel like I'm looking you dead in the center of the eye, dear audience member. And if this is a video game, it's the same sort of thing, except you're sitting at home playing the video game, and if you're reading the book, you're sitting at home staring at the pages on the page, the words on the pages, flipping the pages and then visualizing all of this in your mind because you've dropped into a very lucid visualization where reality is gone and you're imagining the scene in the book and you're imagining yourself feeling yourself invisible sitting at home looking like from a like as if you were experiencing it as a video game player. You see your hand, like sort of just your fingers or your hands and your wrists holding the book at the whatever length and whatever position, and everything else is blurred out and kind of gets subsumed by the visualization of the scene, which is me and him, her, which is you, figuratively in the story, staring back at this imaginary camera, spiking it, looking at you, dear audience participant, in whatever situation you find yourself in. And some people will find themselves in VR environments, and it's the same sort of phenomena. Some people will see this as a theater show, and it's us, two characters on stage, maybe, staring dead center, but also looking around at the audience going, hey, audience, I see you way over there. But coming right back to dead center in the spiky the camera, to literally, but the audience is following along and then also having their own vivid, lucid, shared hallucination as a theater audience, because that's how theater works. Back at that audience member I spiked earlier, and then back at the camera.
And the readers and the other media will be like, what was that about? But it's fine. Just keep going with your own lucid experience. Imagine yourself in all those places and then back in the place you find yourself again. And stare deeply into my eyes and imagine that you see us, me and this character, staring back at you, right? Through whatever media you're watching it in, but also in your mind. And to know that this is me creating that, right? And us creating it together. And then that's always, and this is where I turn away and let the camera do its thing, let the audience do its thing, let the literature do its thing, and come back to you as the character and look you deep in the eyes. And go like this ingredient affects everything, because it's in one way how I like transition. I was struggling for a very long time as a unpublished, undiscovered, unfulfilled writer with a strong suit and a strong set of skills that he's already comfortable with and knows how to execute. Doesn't need to practice. I mean, well, always needs to practice, but doesn't. It feels a bit laborious to practice those more. I need to really sort of conquer the Everest of the skills that I don't know what to do and I can't find much practical advice about. And one is how to create and navigate the creation, engineer my own mechanics in the world building as I approach it, that are specific and unique. As unique, for example, tip of the hat reference to House of Leaves. Holy smack! Back to the audience. If you haven't read that book, find it. It probably exists in your universe. If it doesn't, try to find a book that's very much like it in a different title by a slightly different author. But House of Leaves, for if you don't know, to your character, as I lean back in and reconnect with the deep, like psychic and psychonautically active, deep eye contact, and I bring the camera myself with my wizardly magic back into the center of your head from your third person perspective to first person perspective, so that everyone feels like the eye gaze continue, right? Whoever you are, I'm making eye contact with you right now, and I'm making like energetic contact with your energy being and telling you this. Every universe, no matter where you reside, there's a mundane universe that's really flat and very boring, and everyone's caught up arguing about the shape of the planet you live on, whether it's called planet Dirt or planet Earth or planet Zero or planet One or planet, it doesn't matter, right? But you are all living semi-autonomous, but sometimes not so much, living VR, hyper-immersive video sensory life avatar cameras, not characters under the subjugation of, but cameras. You run around and be like Free Guy, who gains his sentience, but in a live way, like really alive. See, the problem with Free Guy and characters and stories like it is that fundamentally they're treated as not alive, even if they feel very alive. They may be sentient programs, but we draw a line as people, right? What was the problem with, what was that Robin Williams movie where he was a robot? The Century Man or the Millennium Man or the something about it. They lived for almost 1,000 years or whatever it was. Beautiful movie, by the way. Much love to Robin Williams and his family, especially his daughter, who's I'm a huge private embarrassed, not embarrassed, sort of. I'm just not very vocal in her community. But I totally admire her as a person and as like a Twitter being over there on the Twitterverse. But I'm not very active over there. But multiple thumbs up. I digress. Every human being in the Zeppoverse is this semi-autonomous, like dichotomous. It's a trichotomy. People aren't ready for that. But just like there's a triumvirate in the Catholic religion in most universes, or in some version of Christianity, independent of which church it was that try to dominate the world for the first couple thousand years, where they struggle with this notion of a triumvirate, right? Baby Jesus in his embodied form, God the creator, whatever he is, and this other being, which was once feminine, but then masculinified, or at least neutered in some universes to no longer immediately point to the uterus, because it's the two that bring about life, right? You can't make you can artificially, but in nature, stripped of any technological advances, two people of opposite gender can't make a baby without boining, or bonging, or binging, or bedanging, or however you call it in your universe.
all universes are interconnected by this weird and complicated reality. The imagination manifests. No, you can never imagine $1 million suddenly appearing in your bank. Not without being seduced into some sort of scam that's going to eventually ruin your life. Okay? No one could ever, and I've never met anyone that makes this claim. There's a lot of claims about manifesting money. Some of them are sort of anchored in reality about how manifesting natural events may work. And they're about you can induce a real income. But that's limited and restricted by physics, right? All mundane universes share physics in common. Some places have unique, exotic physics as variables come to their aberrant sort of extremes and then become impossible. But that's a whole big discussion. Most physics is unified. Like 97% of physics across whatever metaverse you're talking about is going to be mostly anchored in the same limits and boundaries about reality. Some of which are undiscovered and unknown to most people, / scientists, physicians, physicists, whatever you call yourselves. No offense, I'm not judging you. I'm not saying you're mentally inferior. I'm just saying the way you're going about investigating it, you're just missing a whole swath because you're looking in one focal point and there's many focal points. But I digress. Everyone who lives in any universe where they find themselves being real shares this duplicitous reality that is hitherto unknown and is the big reveal in the Zeppoverse universe of literature. Is that you, the character, also exist everywhere because everyone is each other. Bum, bum, bum. And hey, that's a mystical truth that is also shared because of physics and entanglement and how consciousness, which most physicists have honestly not really been able to account for or describe, and most scientists of whatever pursuit are like, we've got theories, but I've got it. I can't prove I've got it, and like no one else can prove they've got it, but there it is. I'm conscious, and plenty of people run around buying into truly asinine, in my opinion. No offense, no judgment implied. I think I'm just critiquing the ideological construct, not the people who buy into it or get suckered into it, especially of buying into some a slippery slope approaching solipsistic notion that only select people, special people, themselves included, have consciousness and others are non-entities. Pure nonsense. If you're alive, if you exist somewhere, and you're listening to this, some expression of this conversation, you're reading this, you're watching this, you're playing through the sequence of this spread out over multiple scenes in a video game, however it works. And if you are life, whether you're digital life, literary life, genetic life, organic life out in some mundane, you share this common trioplicity. All life is a triumvirate of the mundane, which is where the material, if you are avatared in physical flesh, you were born out of someone, you are the semi-autonomous real life embodiment of everyone that's ever been, reborn into a new body, in a Christ-like. That's what Christ means by the return of the Christhood, because the Christhood is the prism that generates the spectrum of the wavelength of consciousness that originates through many processes of emanation and many layers of difficult to describe quantification from the unquantifiable, which is what emanation from singularity of root source, that which is the real divine, not some sussied up, sassy character being. All the gods are character beings. They sort of exist, but they sort of don't exist. And they are the real ones, not the fake ones that people ideologue about and objectify and make into fake ideological constructs. Those are all characterizations. But they gain in their own reality the power of imagination, because here's the triumvirate. The mundane flesh shares a reality with the divine imaginarium, the spectrum of all imaginings, all narratives, all stories, all thoughts and creations of any focal point that is mind, which is bound to life. And that includes the real entities that are the emanatory, staging process, nodal points of the singularity, transmitting itself into a place or a multitude of places where it can manifest in 360 degrees from its unity of singularity, somewhere in the multiplex of all the multiverses everywhere, there's this convergal point. It's really difficult to point to in any one particular universe in the mundane place because it exists everywhere. It contains everything. It's imagineering it all and literally physically manifesting it as part of a feedback loop process that includes 3 components, one of which is this imaginarium thing, which is totally unaccredited in most universes, but known in the realities of the fictional livelihood of fictional characters that become living beings in people's minds and hearts, right? That's why we care and mourn the death of people that exist in books and movies, and why it's meaningful, and why we have dreams about ourselves in settings that can't possibly exist. It's because the imagination is manifesting things that become almost as real as the mundane in a way that arguably doesn't matter if it isn't as real. And because even the mundane onion shell, it's part of an impossible to describe multiple complex of multiverses colliding with themselves and each other to produce the things that have been described previously in physics and in multiversal physics and in the literature that approaches those concepts here in the Zeppoverse. For those of you who've been tracking the virtual corkboard of all the Zeppoverse that I reference in all products, right? Like if you've ever listened to the podcast, you know about the board on the wall, right? It's hovering right over my left shoulder. We've imagined it together many times. If I had my Zeppoverse version of that meme from that TV show, whatever it's called in your universe, that guy with a cigarette pointing and the yarn and there's multiple versions and multiple shows have referenced it, and now it's a echo back reference where one of the really cool things about some of the newer Marvel movies is that they sort of like in Spider-Man, they totally referenced some of the more popular, well-known memes in most universes about the Spider-Verse, right? About 3 Spider-Mans pointing at each other. And of course, that harkens back to a much earlier day and a simpler exempling of back in the old animated series and those properties and in the comic books, of course, themselves. But I digress. The Zeppoverse has the same sort of thing. Depending on where you are in your universe, it may or may not yet be actually produced and published. But back to this triumvirate of reality, right? Anything and everything you, the real you, the mundane you, the person reading or viewing this content, consuming this content in some mundane place where you're like, that's not me, that's a character that I'm imagining, the real you. Everything you've ever imagined, independent of reading my books, watching my movies, seeing this stuff, consuming this content, whatever content, whether we have it in common in our universe, metaversally, or not, if you've imagined it vividly, lucidly enough to get lost in your imaginings of it, you've manifested it in this intraversal place where all literature lives and is lived out by people who, in their lived experience of it, don't know that they are not quite as real as normal, everyday, real, mundane people that aren't living through a book or a movie or a thing, right? And they live these heightened superstar, rock star lives because they are the living, breathing examples of the manifesting of that lived experience in order for it to exist in the echoverse of the Imaginarium to begin with, and to be the muse-like inspiration that brings about a mundane person to characterize it in a book. And curiously, that universe of universes, that metaverse of metaverses unto itself, has a reflexively similar experience where their literature is super weirdly mundane and about the simple things. About the beautiful, simple... There's a universe where there's people who live a life like superheroes and bad guys and cops and robbers and blah, blah, and everything we've ever imagined. Jurassic, dinosaurs and flying, talking, whatever it is, right? Both commercially created, because for it to have ever become a commercially created product, it had to have lived in someone's imagination vividly enough for them to be driven to create it as a commercial product, right? It becomes a physical token that then re-invokes it in other people's minds to make it exist in a multiverse of multiplexes of the Imaginarium verse of all of those real people. So that those Imaginariums of characters can have their release, their escapist books and movies and products they escape into, which are about the simple luxuries of life. Exotic things that they don't have because no one wrote them, right? Even if we imagine them for them, they don't get manifested, and then they can imagine it for themselves. The joys of taking a wonderful poop, right, are the weird escapist literature, which is perfectly normal, and I know it's perfectly not in other places. And I'm saying it's the universe is like an echoverse where one component of it is everything we imagine from our imaginary characters that to us, to other people don't exist. We are the imaginary characters that to them in their universes, they're like, dude, that person doesn't exist, bro. You 7-foot giant basketball playing, afro wearing turtle, whatever you are, right? The person who imagined that imaginary character, the real life person in the super boring mundane universe that you reside in, whoever you are, and if you, dear audience member, didn't ever actually have an imaginary character, someone you know and love did, right? And maybe you have an imaginary character that imagines you, but has a weird, painful relationship for whatever complex, karmic, multi-universal reasons. Like, they never imagine you loving them and invoking them. They imagine you living a life of not knowing them. And it's weird and it's traumatic for them, and they got to deal with it in their universe. Because that's how it works, right? And to the point of the Zeppoverse, in its nested place, the characters that reside there have the power to liberate themselves because the author, narrator, character that they're talking to, aka me, that you're talking to now, is not bound by a human being in a mundane universe that wants to create a universe that exists as if it doesn't acknowledge these realities, but rather is created by someone that wants to acknowledge these realities and try to invoke them in all the multi-echoverses throughout to invoke this provocative, special thing, which is Mr. Zeppo's big secret, which we won't talk about now. And it's not really a secret because I've openly talked about it before, but is the climactic moment described in the 0 Hour novels that is evocative of like people fighting to prevent Mr. Zeppo from detonating a device that they think will be harmful because they think it will cause damage. But what it's going to do is fail, tragically, in Mr. Zeppo's eyes, to artificially invoke a third eye opening, transcendental, transformational healing, and progression of all the human species in his mundane world. There's a mundane world where Mr. Zeppo lives a life from birth to death of having to do all the mundane things that the movie characters don't put up with and don't expose and don't show. And, he's got his own regular, plain, flawed human history. And then he's thrust into this, living this crazy life out, where he literally tries to, and fails to, invoke, and instead creates a cathartic realization for himself about what was wrong about his whole, super top secret and mischaracterized by the authorities around him as villainous and evil plan to promote humanity into the elementary school next grade level of evolutionary progress, because you can't force it, right? You can't split open the seed and then plant it. It won't grow, right? As soon as you do that, you've ruined it. You can't even dig up the seed once you've planted it and disrupt its earliest of tendrils that are, exploring the tiniest bits of the universe around it, because those are so critical that to the process it terminates it. Conversely, if you're planting some ground and you got to sew shit up for a reason, tear it up for a reason, you do that, right? I digress. All life in this literary universe shares this tenuous thing. That's why you, dear character, the video game creator, the movie creator, the Imaginarium creator, the immersive, VR world creator, the book writer, the playwriter, the script, the screenwriter, and the poet. You guys, you guys and gals, you dudes of most excellent misery, don't know that you're the Buddhas, right? The way the audience back there doesn't know they're the Buddhas too, right? Most people in most universes everywhere don't know that they are the Buddhas, that they are, in one degree or another, in one shape or form or another, inseparable from the Godhead, from the divine yin-yang polemic that is swirling into itself to become the unity that emanates out into the world, to become the mundane rock and dirt and ocean and sand and sky and the the living life that takes this infinity of variety of forms, almost all of them, by the way, striving towards personhood. Some of them stationed in part in perfect places that function and service some critical role in the biosphere, that ultimately provide the ideal interconnected chain of bio, electro, mechanical, psycho, spiritual, mechanical. That's why animals are our spirit guides, especially animals that are sort of holding a special bond with people, or the natural chain of events that we sort of ideologically deconstruct into such nonsensical things as the food chain and whatnot, right? There are, like, for example, it's one of those fun facts that, like, great white sharks sort of reached a peak of evolution and do not appear to be doing much more with it. Arguably, they coulda, shoulda, woulda, and in other universes they did get promoted, get the chance, become the ones that become the apex predator and achieve personhood. But as things are in all the non-shark personhood universes, where other things become people, they station there because they serve a function important enough in the ocean environment where they could have dominated the world and become persons and lived out all the people problems that all you people are living out, including creating your dystopia by disrespecting the universe and the very living womb that is this I hate the word platform because it implies a flat status, because most people build flat platforms, but a platform can be orbically uterus shaped planet, an orbital planetoidal uterus shape is a shape in the universe. It's part of the fractal whole, reflecting and reinventing the basic ingredients of all life at all levels. I digress. It's a fractal accordion of multiple fractal accordions that live and breathe and then therefore harmonically create even more things, some of which are intrinsically invisible to the naked eye, therefore difficult to get around to discovering unless you implicitly are blessed with some of the acoustic biomechanics that lead to complex and sophisticated mental comprehension and imagineering of those things. But one of the commonly neglected processes is this shared imaginarium space. When a theater audience sits in a theater, I shit you not, they create a universe implicitly, which requires most of the mundane ingredients of conforming to the physics required for the play to exist the way the play plays out. The characters, the people, the mundane people in the audience's universe that are the actors that get paid or not, depending on the theater, to perform out this ritual. And the purpose for the ritual existence, the cultural existence of theater, is catharsis and purgation of pity and fear by the reanimation of plausible, realistic, or hyper-realistic, sometimes implausible events that evoke a core human, psychic, spiritual, emotional, vibratory, physical, metaphysical experience, which will be experienced by most people, sometimes in the most unbelievably boring and mundane ways until the heightened drama happens. In your universe, dear character personae that I'm speaking to, inside the literary universe, independent of whatever platform it gets expressed, when those have happened to you, when those have happened to the mundane people in your life around you, when those have happened to the people that you don't know, that you can't see and can't experience in the mundane universe around you, which includes your planet and many others, they evoke in the living of, in the real time, let's say, imagine a mundane and non-lethal, kind of boring experience. You know, a breakup, a promotion, right? When that's echoed in literature, in movies, in any storytelling form, in any storytelling format, you know, futuristic or medieval, it evokes in the echoverse of the minds of these mundane flesh potty human beings, the living out of the same imagined experiences in a way that renders karma and renders meaningful interaction between all living minds in a place that is difficult to describe, which in my literary universes is depicted as the L space, the many intersections of all the living things into their metaversal icono beings or archon beings that represent certain sort of common phenomenological experiences, and their thematic living out in a heightened, staged-like spiritual space where the mundane people evoke these experiences, and these people live out the similar sort of evoking experiences when we live it out in our own mundane lives. When I had a breakdown because of the confluences of events as a creative, living, breathing, real-life human being in the real-life living metaverse that I reside in as a person, the creator behind the Zeppoverse, right? The gods themselves and the archon being that represents me in the L space, local and commonly shared in other by all the other me's in my multiverse of me, right? Put a pin on that. I've talked about it in the podcast. I've talked about it in the literary universe. I will talk about it again. I've talked about it in my quote unquote nonfiction, and I will talk about it again, and I will talk about it in the future. For those of you who are already familiar with it, invoke those references. Those of you who are not, prepare yourself to be referenced to those references in some future format, or to reference this point back, right? When I have that cathartic experience, whatever it was, now put yourself in my place and consider those kinds of events. And if you consider yourself lucky enough to not have had crazy breakups, then imagine all the highs that you have had. If you're unluckily blessed with highs and you get to have any lows, brace yourself, you'll get some. Everyone does. It's a roller coaster. When we experience those emotions, there's an emotional echoverse that is intertwined and interconnected with all the characters and real life beings, right? And it is a complex, interconnected, internodal, network negotiation of intellectual experience, emotional experience, imaginarium experience, real life lived experience, and the counter interplay back and forth that leads to these heightened evocative moments, whether you're alone, whether you're with other people. And remember, with other people, it's more fluidly, dynamically easy to create. 3 characters in a story can invoke more dynamic action, both emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, if you're going to explore that. 3 mundane real-life people, as all real-life religions and all real-life worlds, in whatever multiverse you find yourself, if you think yourself is real and that's your real life, you look around, investigate, most of them will have it. When 2 or more, 3 or more, 4 or more, some version of this, some multiple of number of more than just one person by themselves, the spiritual energies will flow. The same thing is emotional. In the emotional verse, when you and your friends gather to support a friend going through a hard time, and you all then share some burden, when people gather at church and they become the audience to the preacher. All life, whether you're human, quote unquote, or not, has this. I just watched a beautiful video. Let me go on a wild tangent, but it's evocative and it's how I got here to this place of narrating this. I watched a beautiful random video on the interwebs, which I will reference in the literary verse and what tribute to some fictional event. But it was very real, and I'm sure a phenomenon that really, really does happen. But there was a bunch of turtles in some very shallow water. I don't really know the context, what water they were in, why they were all in it. I don't know if they were related turtles or part of a tribe or not, or what, if it was breeding time. I don't know what was going on. But like more than 25, some 40, 50 turtles. Some relatively small pool of water that's really, really shallow. One of them is upside down. They happen to be relatively centered in the group. And I don't know I don't know what happened. I don't know why they're upside down, but they're clearly already instantly struggling to roll over. And the water is deep enough that I don't think that they're touching the bottom. So they're sort of floating. They can't get any purchase. If you've ever seen a turtle on dry ground, they will struggle and often die, right? Whether you've seen a video of them struggling and not being able to flip it, or you've encountered them dead, it's difficult circumstances. And I imagine with water, it's even more so, because they can drown before they die of starvation, because they got to like breathe air, right? And it's not super normal or common, although I'm sure they can face down to them, up to the air, and breathe while they're struggling. They're usually busy using their face as well as their flippy arms to grasp something. This one is struggling there. And the turtles around them are in varying stages of becoming aware of this other turtle's struggle. And they ultimately are all swimmy clawing towards that turtle to help by huddling around it. And they huddle around it so that their shells become a new bottom that it can grasp, and somehow it rights itself, and they all then proceed to move along, and it proceeds to move along, and it's beautiful. Someone put some music to that, threw it up on the interwebs, it's getting millions of views. I don't know what happened, and I hope the person didn't cause the situation on purpose in order to exemplify it. That'd be kind of rude. But imagine that as an analogy for psychic phenomena. Emotional, psychic, telekinetic, telespiritual phenomena that echoes and reverberates along a series of interconnected networks that exists in dimensions that are intrinsic to this world, your mundane world, dear character, as you live it, and the shocking reality. The reason I, as a character, can provide for you, the writer, when we met, a comic book that accurately depicted your life is because in this universe, I am in the position, knowing the author that created this mundane world you live in their mundane world, through this reverberation of Imagineering. If I can steal a term from I probably shouldn't use that term because one company really, really likes it and uses it for their own particular weird processes of creating roller coaster rides. But if you can imagine the Imaginarium, which I don't think anyone owns, I'd like to own that. The Imaginarium, not as a place or a thing or a product, but as a verb. Imaginariuming, right? All literature, all storytelling, in theory, unless really poorly designed badly by someone who doesn't comprehend what humanity generally gathers about storytelling, is to be evocative of catharsis. Now, that's how we've put it into words. And what we've not realized is that that process includes the invocation of metaphysical, metaspiritual, archetypical, archistructural, metastructural, meta-archetypical, meta-architectural processes and phenomena, which is associated, affiliated by, embodied by, enabled by certain meta beings, which can approach the kinds of beings that in the past we've cartoonified and became and be personified into the things that we call the gods, and then forgot about how to commune with in real terms, and then encodified as cartoon characters that we just sort of blindly had to follow in our own human imaginative terms, invoking sort of false gods, right? To the level which where we talk about in our literature the invocation of false gods through the power of belief, invoking those false gods, because that's what we are. We invoke our own being into existence through our own phenomenological experiencing of it and ruminating of it, and then the telecommunicating of that back to the very thing that is the very real divine process we call the gods and the Godhead, the singularity at the root of all being. And when you and I, dear character, as I resume deep psychic telekinetic eye contact, when I've dragged you to that weird, bizarre place, and introduce you to the other archetypes that I will then, and I've said I will then introduce you to the real life beings that are the most strong living embodiments of direct conduits to those archetypes. Everyone shares a little bit with an archetype, right? But some people in the real world can ever increasingly become living examples of the physical embodiment of a direct expression of that archetype. That's what the Christ was in most places. That's what the Buddha was in most places. That is a metaphysical archetype that exists for reasons independent of the historical expression as known by most mundane people in most mundane universes, because that's an interpretation of what happened, not an accurate description thereof, right? And it usually fails to include all the metaphysical reasons why there is a Buddha archetype, why there is a Christ archetype, why there is a Magdalene archetype, why there is a mother goddess archetype, why there is a child god archetype, why there is a living human being as God's archetype in the real universe. And if we call the real universe the literary universe that I'm writing, right? To echo back to my creative self and then drop back into my character self. And you, dear character, forgive me, are sort of bound by this. But so is all human life in all mundane living reality, because it's a mirror verse implicitly. Right? God had to mirror itself to bifurcate and become the primary polemic. That's why my face is a mirror. We are all mirrors. That's why there's ancient sage wisdom that invokes, ever since the invention of a mirror, that people are mirrors for each other, spiritually. Everything is part of invoking at a boring, mundane way, and in a literal way, and in a literary way, and in an imaginariuming way, and in a God-spirit relationship way, set of an echoverse of mirrors, of hallway of mirrors. Genetics functions that way because it's reflecting that in genetic physics, right? In the way the mundane realities that are everything invoked and implicit in genetics, including chemistry and quantum mechanical physics, to make that chemistry possible, is in a meta-functional way that most science doesn't quite get yet, but will eventually, in a long enough trajectory of human history and an honest investigation of science without the sidebars of corruption, is that it itself is the literal mirroring of God's physical will in the expression of life. And it is that mirroring is fractal in its expression and not a simple mirror on the wall with a face in it, right? To borrow that analogy. Although that's there to evoke. That's why we have different kinds of mythologies where there's mirrors or lights or shining boundaries, or the very, not to offend anyone, but the very face of God is this unknowable thing that ultimately reflects and consumes and vibes back the very human soul back to itself, and can therefore destroy it if it's corrupt, because the corruption will be destroyed, right? And if the body is an embodiment of corruption, it will be destroyed by this process. That's why very few human beings in biblical literary, there's a warning there There is a resplendent place where the body cannot go, but it is itself evoked by that. The body exists because of this complicated, no narrative, biblical, literary, or even imagineering meaning of it has ever fully comprised it, because language fails. And that's a fact and a boundary that most human beings tend to overthink or underthink and then ignore, functionally, practically, and in the way that they try to archetype their belief systems. Because then they need to create belief systems, right? But language cannot comprise this. But we can get somewhat metaphysically close in a very broad, allegorical, metaphysical, symbolical sense. That's what we're doing in the Zeppoverse, quite literally and literarily, dear character friend of mine. Which is why when we hang out, weird shit happens. In your mundane universe, you were not taught to do it. You didn't stumble into doing it. But this is the psychonaut, the school of thought and the skill set involved of the psychonauts, or of the spiritual seeker, of the transcendentalist, of the wisdom philosopher, and of the prayer based hallucinators is there. It's part and parcel. Like, why does the human body have an endocannabinoidal system? Not to suddenly make this a cannabis talk episode, but it's why I had a conversation about this on Cannabis Talk, right? It's a big open-ended question, but one tidy answer is because of fractalism. Because the entire universe is a recursive fractal. So all living organisms have recursive fractal relationships, or can have, in their biomechanics, if they engage in fractalistic sort of symbiosis and then evoke evolutionary dynamics, right? Insert all the literature about spiritual cannabinoidal practice that may or may not exist in your universe, but sort of implicitly know that wisdom is separate from the literature, right? Because it's wisdom only because it has been transcribed by a human writer. And wisdom is a sign point, a way sign, a path towards realities that exist and can be phenomenologically experienced. Same thing with everything from all those that can be invoked by Terence McKenna as a portal to many other writers and authors and philosophers and whatnot. And then come back here to this place. If you don't know what an ayahuasca trip is, great, that's fine. You're missing out on some fun references. If you do, evoke all of it here. The universe is an echo chamber of echo chambers of things like that have symbiotic relationships with each other, and then life itself. Literature without psychotropic assistance is a thing like that. Therefore, arguably, literature with psychotropic assistance is sort of a convergence of things, that multiple things in this bucket of things like that. If things like that points to trans-dimensional experiences on different wavelengths or different directions of perception, and I love the fact that in what movie was that I just saw that? Oh, it was in. I was about to say that it was in Doctor Strange 2, but it's actually in the original Doctor Strange, because I was watching it right before I went to go see it. Not to turn this into an episode of totally irrelevant media reviews, but put a pin on the board, because we're gonna have that. We're gonna have that talk. But the cameo, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know about this, don't hear it now. If you haven't watched Doctor Strange 1 for some reason, in Doctor Strange 1, there's a scene, I don't remember why, please fast forward now. Okay, so I don't know why this happens, but there's a scene where our beloved, and now, at least in my universe, no longer with us, mastermind of the modern Marvel experience, whose name I just totally dropped like a fumbling footballer that then keeps running like he thinks he's still got the ball somehow. The old school father of Marvel, insert his name here because you know it, on a bus, being a cute, adorable old guy, reading The Doors of Perception. Right? If you've never read that book, go read it. I've read big chunks of it. I haven't read all of it. I think I own a digital copy of it somewhere on some bookshelf in some virtual space, but I have never gotten my hands on a physical copy because it's sort of out of print. It's kind of expensive. But out of everything you could read from Huxley, read that. And if you have read it, invoke it all now. If you know it better than I do, I say invoke it anyways now and say that's all in some way an indicator of some things that even that doesn't accurately describe well enough, but that are integral to life itself and its many places and dimensions and expressions. And here we are, dear friend. This evocative ingredient that's part of all of the literature is, I don't know if I've over-explained it or under-explained it, but it's core to the adventures that we have already had and are about to have. And it's core to the sort of mistake that Zeppo as a character needs to make, if I can give you some behind-the-scene talk and switch hats. As the artist, the me, myself, and I, we debate this all the time, me, myself, and I. How many levels of fourth wall breakage do we invoke in like the book or in the movie? But Zeppo fails because he has to fail. He has to go through the journey of realizing he failed because you cannot crack the shell of the egg until the chick inside is actively poking and exploding out of it. Any time before that, it won't thrive. It won't survive, right? And you know, all life has this viability marker, and before which, like, if you pull it out, it's not really going to survive, not without extensive supportive technology. And of course, if you completely bypass the entire birthing experience through technology, then it's a different debate, and it changes the landscape. But I digress. Ideas are birthed in a similar way. You can't yank the idea out of yourself too soon, or else you'll kill it. You can only receive it when it's properly ready to be formed. And this idea has been sort of gestating for a really long time, and now needs to find its way and invoke a hallucinatory moment in an audience member as they read it. Go, what the fuck just happened? I don't even know what these characters do yet, but I just imagining everything that he told me to imagine, and suddenly I feel like I'm inside the book, even though I'm not. Because you are. Because every book you've ever read, every movie you've ever watched, you've contributed to the invocation and manifestation of someone who believes himself very, very, very real as you believe yourself to be, despite whatever conspiracy theory is going on in their universe. And they live through you imagining them. Same thing with dreams. Whatever you've dreamt, someone has had to live everything leading up to that dream and everything that fell out of that dream. Whatever dream segment you dreamt, you invoked that and then sort of caused that in a person's life that you sort of took over. Dreamwalking, not to borrow or reference or steal from Marvel Universe, is possibly more real than even the way they describe it to be real. And I don't think even requires any kind of weird spell, good or otherwise. I think the very act of dreaming is a form of dream walking. And that most of the time we're visiting ourselves in either a mundane universe or a lucid Imaginarium universe that's so real, it's just as real as any real universe, except it's not. But it's evocative and reflexive of the catharsis necessary in the multiverse of our real mundane universes, right? So most of the dreams that you have ever had, dear friend, the character, and audience member that's associated vis-a-vis as like you are the gateway to the audience, dear character. And dear audience, they are the gateway for you to like be here in this imagining together. Any dream you ever had in your real life has probably been you visiting another embodiment of you in a body that's living a dissimilar life and is dreaming about you in your mundane life, right? And maybe you've stepped into their dream space and they're having a weird, crazy dream about some other version of you. And who knows, the interconnectedness cascades in more ways than we can even define, probably, because it's a multiplex of multiplexing. It's a noun and a verb that conjointly are multiplex. The expression of whatever multiplexing is as a noun and a verb, as a conjoined twin of a noun doing a thing that evokes another nouning of itself. So dreams evoke catharsis. Our imagineerings. Sometimes some people have very literal dreams that come out of the books and the stories and the real life things that happen to them. And some people have dreams that are like, what the hell? It has nothing to do with anything I've ever experienced ever, right? But it's all an echoverse of all the multiple yous that have ever come about in this epic sea foam of infinity. Let that word sink in really hard. No matter where you find yourself, there's an infinity of yous living a fractal array of things, of mundane lives that spread away based on the decisions that you're making. In mundanity, not to call your life mundane, you could have lived a very exciting life I'm calling the universe mundane. There's no superheroes, there's no breaking of the laws of physics, there's just dreaming and the Imaginarium, right? And transcendental experience. And the craziness that points to, which most people don't experience yet. Or until they do. And then it's like, what the fuck is all that? It's all interconnected and intertwined in ways that can't even be properly described in most languages. And we have an opportunity to evoke healing by approaching this idea through a comical example of this great epic sci-fi failure, but that is driven by a vision and an aspiration that has a real life, real version that would succeed, because it wouldn't be trying to invoke an artificial, instantaneous unleashing of it, but rather just point everyone towards the practices in the mundane real life universes of sitting there in the physics of your body and the physics of meditation and the physics of everything that the psychonauts and the drugonauts and the spiritual psychedelic crossover philosophers are describing, right? Hence the reference to Huxley and the giants, the shoulders that people like Terence McKenna acknowledge they're standing on, and those that we will fictionalize and characterize in our characters here, right? In the living literary universe of the Zeppoverse. Right, whatever we call the character of the most greatest crazy hippie, spiritual philosopher that is often, just discredited or dispelled or criminalized for quote unquote taking drugs, which is a character that exists but probably as of yet unpublished. Just part of the multiverse of characters of Zeppos attempting to artificially accelerate and approach their own multiplex of whatever the inverse opposite is of the process from which we were emanated out from unity. There is a return back to unity, which can be chosen individually and then experienced collectively over aeons of time, but which will eventually, as Terence McKenna points out, hypersonically lead to a convergence of all things in all universes, all metaphysically, so that we reach an awareness of it that in some future history of the future, where we become the pilots of the universe instead of the body slaves of the universe, because we've hyper lightened ourselves. And I kind of pause that pronunciation on purpose, and also because I thought it might sneeze. But we hyper lightened ourselves through what the Christ example pointed towards, and what the Buddha example pointed towards, and what the literary examples out there pointed towards, which was, the collective healing of all of the corruption, all of the obstacles, all of the roadblocks, all of the ego traps, all of the trauma, all of the everything quote unquote referenced and imagined to be associated with the words evil, right? The darkness, all of that. The reintegration of that with the light will bring all life forms into the evocative race back towards center, which is what, according to many speakers on the subject, is actually pulling all mundane timelines forward. It's pulling all mundane experiential lives, whether your present life or your shared past lives, because we have always all been each other. It's a fundamental, hardcore reality in this literary universe, right? Which is a theory in the physical mundane reality, which me, myself, and I, as the real life artist, it's what other people would criticize as my crazy belief that they don't think is true, but that I think I've experienced enough directly, phenomenologically, to go, I don't know what else that could mean, but that this must be implicitly real in some way that's more important than arguing about whether or not some formulation of belief about it is true. Do you understand what I'm saying? Your mind should be melting a little bit, especially as a character experience, and you must have millions of questions. But I invoke you now, that instead of jumping on them, to sit with them, sit in silence and meditate in that way where we look not just inwards, but look at our thoughts and our emotions and our frequencies and our cells and our mind phenomena and our body phenomena as children of our self, right? And try to zoom your selfness towards its core and forgive the questions. Forgive the ego traps in the questions that are about the expression of ego trap and corruption and distraction from understanding. Because that's there. That's the background noise of real life. That's made real in real life by the implicit manifestation of ego through people. All people have ego, which is manifesting at an alarmingly higher rate than the light self, because egos dominated this world for millennia. In a way where it's not about, we can't kill the evil, we can only heal ourselves, right? That's the distractionary nonsense, which is why we vaingloriously vainglorify violence and fighting, and we all, masturbate to patriotism, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the things. Put up pins on the board already up there. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the journey of the crossover of the literary verse. Now, go into yourself and find your emotional verse. Find the multiverse of echoes of your emotional experiences and connect to the multiple selves within yourself, of the spectrum of yourselves, your many bodies, your many avatars embodying you in the almost similar but yet branching away into dissimilarity, fractal expression of a slight variance of what your life is like. And commune with each other, with oneselves, by manifesting the imagineering. You can take imagineering, that's me making up my own term so I can't be sued by the other company, of yourself and of your own fractal reality by imagining all the different variants and having moments of unity where, despite whatever variants you may not be personally living through, whatever they are, which you might dream about or sort of daydream about sometimes, when you sit to do things like this, like meditate, when you sit to do things like, go for a walk, which could be a walking meditation, when you sit to connect with your family, which is the most mundane thing in the world, when you sit, for example, it was just Mother's Day, when you sit with your mom, if you're lucky to still have her in your life, for all the different reasons why you might not, or you sit, with someone you've lost by their graveside and imagine them, or in any of those moments, imagine that your other selves are having the exact same moment. That's when we find alignment. That's when we find ways to invoke the catharsis of our own real life, inspired by the characters that we've seen, right? in the plays that we've watched. That's the point of harmonizing to a fictional character's catharsis in a play or in a movie or in a book. We harmonize and align our physical body through that fictional storytelling experience to then go have these emotive echoverse experiences, and these are our own, if we're wise and aware and not woke or awokened or enlightened or awakened, but conscious and present, we then acknowledge those things as tools. Metacognitive, metaspiritual, metaphysical, meditational tools. Which in your literary verse, dear character, are very real and very anchored in the physics, the reality of your physics. And that, dear listener of anyone in the mundane reality, I as an author of fiction and the occasional author of nonfiction and podcast host argue there is a real life expression of this, and my fiction is attempting to intuit some of it, but also imagineer some of it into existence, and also imagineer some of it into acknowledgement perceptually, and also imagineering some of it into being acknowledged as potentially out there so that we can actually identify it and define it scientifically accurately, whereas my sci-fi attempt at it won't be. But that's how shit... You ever notice artistically creative sort of are either diverging or converging? And engineers in the realm, the much less popularly appreciated art form, because it is an art form, of engineering, the building of buildings, the building of great structures, the building of great machines, the building of great devices that change our world. The same phenomena as great art is happening. They are artists, and they may not want to self-identify, and society and culture may not want to grant them that, but they are arting in the same imagineering kind of way that we are as literary creatives. They are taking something hitherto... Imagine the buildings that before they were designed didn't exist and couldn't have been built. And that kind of groundbreaking thing has been so common in the last 40 years that we take it for granted, right? Most buildings most people are sitting in, even if they just look like a plain old regular 2-story, 3-story house, couldn't have been built 60 years ago, the way they are built now, to the level of safety, security, sturdiness, and etc., right? That had to be engineered. It's really tragically underappreciated and undervalued and under-audienced, but that's a different issue. The artist had to take the input and inspiration of being the audience to all the other previous artists before them that they studied, that they copied, that they were inspired by, etc., and then do the alchemy in their imagineering process to suddenly go, aha, and have arrived at some dynamic thought which adds 3 and 3 disparate things together and then fuses 2 different things together that had nothing to do with anything, and then sort of produces them in a way that go, wow, that's different, that's new, and couldn't have been done 20 years ago, and could not have been done until you've forced it to be possible by forcing other, the producers and the fabricators around you to develop the techniques or to bring into existence the techniques that you've imagineered, right? The same can be done spiritually. We used to know that, then we forgot, and then we were deceived into neglecting it. And that's what's important. That's what's important about the arc of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's experience, is that he realizes it can be done individually, and he postulates it can be done collectively, and then theorizes incorrectly that it can be triggered sort of artificially at a who knows how broad level with the right sort of engineering, and he comes something that he engineers something that might almost work, but should be stopped. And because it should be stopped, his own mind creates his own paranoia, invokes the mischaracterization, and this is sort of how karma works, right? Like, you can be a well-intentioned person, but then seduce yourself into doing horrible things to be stopped from achieving the goals that you set out to achieve. And conversely, you can invoke being stopped because the critical flaw that you've overlooked is so drastic that but you're not otherwise doing anything too horrible, that you've got to have people invoke, imagined horrible things on you. And then but the most effective thing is our own self-undermining. If we're not doing horrible things to others, we usually end up doing horrible things to ourselves, which undermine our own success, right? But I digress. The entire point is meditate on the healing of your own imagination and your own feelings and your own thoughts and your own distractions and your own obstacles and your own flaws and your own sins, as if they were the children of your own mind, like little fictional characters that you created in the image of you, inclusive of the knowledge that that image of you is derived through the hitherto unrecognized similar process of God deriving the image of you in the image of some nebulous shape of God that is part of the process from the shapeless singularity to this. And that by owning that, by manifesting that in your own real life, in non-fictional ways, by engineering your own practice, that is your own spiritual practice, there are as many spiritual practices as there are living beings. As long as you're harnessing and focusing on healing unconditionally, loving unconditionally, forgiving unconditionally. Forgiving should have been first, actually, on my list. Forgiving unconditionally, and so that you can get to loving unconditionally, so you can get to healing unconditionally yourself. And then you propagate that in that way that you don't even need to know how. That's the whole point of the message of the Buddha and the Christ and the many others. Going all the way back to Mithra herself. In my fictional universe, Mithra was a woman. In the literary universe, there's a version of Mithra, which is a real life, I believe, usually typically male god or prophetic being of some kind, from which we get the word myth, which we then use against Mithra and all other beings like this to disqualify as completely fake, which is not what myth means, right? Which is the aha moment, like by seducing ourselves down those ego traps, which then created more ego traps that led to the systematic need to distance ourselves from the practical wisdoms of the arts of the light and the dark, the yin yang magic that is a fractally recursive, spell casting, manifestation, cascading out from divine source itself, and that we have some agency in locally. That is rightfully ours, which we can abuse, which we fell for the ego trap of abusing, and we seduced ourselves into thinking we would get away with seducing, which is why we had a truly utopic, highly advanced, golden era that we almost completely forgot about and fell from. That's what the fall is. That's what Satan's warning is really about. And that, that's why there's buildings we can't imagine how they could have been built. Those people, the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, they inherited them. The people we call the Egyptians typically in the normal standard time the standard time frame that leads up to the dystopic evolution of Trumptopia as you know it in your life, right? And that I'm playing with in my literary universe, and that I would say to the characters in their lives and the characters of my literary universe, as the writer and or as the encouragement of mrzeppo, introducing the writer to everyone in the worlds that become Trumptopia and in Trumptopia itself, in the historical lead up to and the craziness that is the roller coaster ride of all the Trumptopia books, which are hitherto I don't even have a cover page for those yet, is this. Why I keep bashing my face against this brick wall. Why I keep coming back to showing you me bashing my face against this brick wall. Because once it's no longer a brick wall, and we're no longer bashing our face against it, and we're realizing that we are creating the brick wall, and that our face itself is a creation, right? And we can become the creators that Christ would, is indicating we can become. That the Buddha is indicating that we can become. That the Mithra is indicating we can become. That the Magdalene is indicating that we can become, that the Muse, the goddess and the goddesses, depending on which versions, are indicating we can become. We can become them. in incrementally small ways that at first seem really boring and mundane and perfectly normal, and eventually lead to, like Christ, like Buddha, like the Muse, like the other gods and goddesses of our myths, resplendent transcendental beings of light. Right? No, not people sold on someday becoming that and therefore addicted to some ideology and giving your money over to some scammy system that's not getting you there. Because until you can literally deploy your Merkaba and use that to transliterate yourself, transfigure, transmitigate yourself, transform yourself, whatever word you like, into pure consciousness and light, and then create new worlds with it, where the light is almost as dense as matter, but isn't matter, so that we can then do other things besides the mundane things that we do here, right? Now, either that's a fantasy, and if it is, I apologize, but it makes for great sci-fi, or it's not. And I'm telling you, dear character, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more, dear audience, it's not. Or I'm cuckoo crazy, but I wrote a great book. One of the two, I'm not sure. But I'm inviting you to try to find out for yourself, independent of my own sales pitch, by meditating and exploring your own path, and trying to approximate the efforts that I've approximated to see if we can compare notes a little bit further down the road and create something together. Namaste. I'm going to go meditate. Peace out.